Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Jagera and Turrbal people as the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to today's Global Insight Series China Market Update webinar. My name is Scott Russell and I'm the Insights Manager within Strategy and Performance. Today you'll hear from TIQ's Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner for Greater China, Rhett Miller, and our guest speaker, David Olsen, AM, National President and Chair, Australia-China Business Council. Today's session and the focus on China market is, of course, topical on a number of fronts. China being Queensland's largest trading partner with almost $44 billion worth of two-way trade during 2024. It is also our largest source of international students and a country with which we share deep people-to-people ties dating back to the 19th century and the role of Chinese migrants in establishing the state's agricultural sector. In an increasingly uncertain and volatile global trade and investment system, China is seeking to reposition as a stable force, offering an opportunity for Queensland to leverage that long-standing relationship, the complementarities between Queensland's export capabilities and Chinese demand, and market access afforded through agreements such as the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. And of course, while much is sometimes made of the headwinds facing the Chinese economy and indeed most global economies, the real story, as you will learn today, is far more nuanced, with China still very much the engine room of 1/3 of global growth. To capitalise on these opportunities against the backdrop of a changing world, TIQ has just released our Queensland-China Trade and Investment Strategy 2025, highlighting our strategic priorities and the opportunities for Queensland exporters and investees. To hear more about these opportunities, I'll shortly hand over to Rhett, but firstly, a quick run through today's agenda. Following on from this brief introduction, I will hand straight over to Rhett for a market update about trends and insights and developments in the Greater China market, including an overview of the trade and investment strategy that has just been released. From there, Rhett will interview David, and from there, we'll allow time at the end for a Q&A session. On that note, and on the housekeeping front, throughout today's session, if you do have questions, please drop them in the chat below. We will facilitate a conversation towards the end of the session. Today's session, I should let you know, is also being recorded. You will receive a link after the session with a link should you wish to play that back, or if you have to drop off early. You will also receive links to both the China strategy and also how you can book a free consultation with TIQ. With that, I will hand over to Rhett Miller. Thank you. To you, Rhett.
Well, thank you very much, Scott, and thank you to all of you joining online for making the time to be a part of today's session. In terms of what I'm going to do today, ladies and gentlemen, is I will provide you with an update on the state of the China market, what that means for Queensland, and also touch on our new Queensland-China Trade Investment Strategy and the strategic priorities that are in that strategy and some of the initiatives that might benefit your business or educational institution. So getting straight into the state of the market, I think the overarching theme continues to be a Chinese economy that's facing some significant challenges. So as I think many on the call would be aware, China's economy has experienced a notable slowdown over the last several years, with concerns about its ability to sustain higher growth rates in the longer term. The property crisis, which began with the default of Evergrande and then spread to other major developers in 2021, rolls on. As a result of the crisis, housing prices have fallen 10.2% in the primary market and nearly 18% in the secondary market over the course of the last 4 years. Estimates vary, but there's somewhere between 65 to 90 million unoccupied and incomplete housing units in China, including completed but unsold units, units purchased but left vacant, and those that are still under construction. And with around 70% of Chinese household wealth caught up in real estate, the property crisis continues to be a significant drag on the economy, impacting both consumer confidence and indeed local investment. A flow-on effect from the property crisis has been mounting government debt levels, particularly impacting local governments. So local governments previously relied on generating revenues by selling land use rights to developers, and that was all very well and good when there was a property boom in China. But when the property crisis hit, that source of revenue then dried up. Local governments have also had insufficient tax authority versus the central government in Beijing, despite being responsible for much of public spending in China, which has forced them to borrow heavily to fill funding gaps. And one of the ways they've done this is through local government financing vehicles, LGFVs, which are effectively state-owned companies that issue debt for projects. LGFVs have become shadow borrowers, raking up trillions of US dollars in debt outside official local government budgets. And as many of the projects they fund are not commercially viable and lack cash flow, for example, roads, stadiums, bridges, these vehicles now struggle to repay this debt. The level of local government debt in China is now at over 14 trillion US dollars, which amounts to over 70% of GDP. And this has the potential to impact financial stability in the longer term, where banks hold large amounts of LGFV debt. It's a drag on growth as it takes away from local government social spending, and it also limits potential fiscal levers that the Chinese government can use to address China's current economic challenges. Consumption continues to be a challenging area as well. Consumption indicators have been better so far in 2025, but some of this is subsidy dependent. So with the property crisis and reduced household wealth, there has been sluggish consumption overall in recent years. The central government, in its March work report, had made driving up consumption its number one economic objective in its continued efforts to shift the economy from being reliant on external factors like investment and exports to being driven by internal demand through consumption, which will also grow the higher value services sector. In its special action plan to boost consumption, the government's committed to developing policies to enhance spending capacity, to bolster consumers' financial capacity, boosting a willingness to spend through strengthening the social safety net. For example, this may include in the future things like raising the minimum wage and looking at increasing pension benefits, and encouraging both digital consumption and boosting local tourism spending by attracting foreign visitors and encouraging domestic tourism. Some of the key incentives that have been implemented so far as part of the plan include subsidies for buying EVs, home appliances, and energy efficient products, particularly in rural areas, as well as a national trade-in program for vehicles and appliances, together with some tax relief for child education, aged care, and housing loan interest. So in terms of how this has fared so far, as I mentioned, the consumption indicators for this year are definitely improved. In May, retail sales of consumer goods climbed 6.4%, which was the fastest growth since December of 2023. And some of this growth is, I believe, attributable to these trade-in subsidy programs that the government has put in place, as well as the June 18 e-commerce shopping festival. So whether these improved indicators in consumption will continue into the future, I think is debatable, noting that these programs that the government has put in place in terms of subsidies, etc., will continue for at least the remainder of 2025. The weakened economy has also seen increased youth unemployment. So China's unemployment rate for those aged 16 to 24 is currently 14.9% as of May. And this rate's calculated for young people, excluding students, focusing on those actively seeking employment. And I think many on the call will be aware that China continues to face longer-term demographic risks with its market due to its aging population and shrinking workforce. For the third consecutive year, China's population declined in 2024, driven by the low birth rates and the aging population. And by 2035, over 400 million people will be over 60, accounting for some 30% of the population. In the longer term, these demographic shifts will impact productivity and growth and will place increasing pressure on China's social security system. And of course, I couldn't talk about the continued challenges facing the market without referring to the geopolitical uncertainties, tariffs, and export restrictions that China has faced vis-a-vis the US. So despite the recent truce in June, as a result of the London talks, which locked in lower tariff levels, the impact has been substantial. China saw a 34% drop in exports to the US in May, which is the biggest drop since COVID began in 2020. And this will place downward pressure on China's growth as an export-oriented economy. Since the trade war began, economists have revised China's growth forecast down to between 4 and 4.5% for this year. And I note that China's official growth target for this year is around 5%. It's also resulted in changes in the global supply chain, with Chinese exporters rerouting shipments through Southeast Asia, in particular Vietnam and Indonesia. And the US is targeting these actions, for example, with increased tariffs on transship goods that go via Vietnam. So if we could move on to the next slide, please, Scott. So, notwithstanding all these challenges, what I really wanted to highlight today is that China is still a market of significant opportunity for Queensland businesses. And there's a few reasons for this. First, I think it's important that we consider the scale of growth in the market. In 2024, China still grew at 5%, reaching a nominal GDP of $18.8 trillion, maintaining its position as the second largest economy in the world. A growth rate of 5% would be an enviable one for many major economies, let alone one that's valued at 18 plus trillion US dollars. It should also be pointed out that although 5% growth was slower than the 5.2% growth achieved in 2023, it was still significantly better than expected, which was driven by a very solid export performance from the market, which exceeded expectations. And some of that, I think, was a result of front loading of exports prior to the new Trump administration coming into place, which I think then turned out to be fortuitous, as well as increased investment in advanced manufacturing and infrastructure. Whether China can achieve its government growth target of around 5% for this year is open to question, but in the circumstances, it was a very impressive rate of growth last year, nonetheless. The second point is that the market complementarities between Queensland and China remain strong and robust. Unquestionably, Queensland continues to have what China wants in resources, energy, food and agriculture, health, education, and tourism. And I'm sure most of you on the call are aware that China is our largest two-way trading partner in goods export market, with goods exports valued at $25.9 billion to May and accounting for nearly a quarter of Queensland exports. But something that you may not be aware of is that for some time, China has also been the fastest growing of our top 4 major export markets of China, Japan, Korea, and India, growing at 2.7% year on year in May. The strength, I think, of our Queensland-China trade complementarities cannot be understated. In food and agriculture, China became the world's largest importer of food as of 2021, which will continue to drive Queensland beef, seafood, horticulture, packaged food, and beverage exports in this sector for the foreseeable future. In resources and energy, China is the world's largest importer of Queensland's key resources exports of coal, LNG, and bauxite. On coal, although China is the world leader in clean energy investment, still some 59% of China's energy comes from coal-fired power, and that will continue to benefit Queensland for some time, noting that the majority of Queensland coal exports are metallurgical, with a smaller proportion going to thermal coal. On LNG, in 2023, China replaced Japan as the top global customer of LNG, and the China market will continue to be an important destination for this product from Queensland, with 60% of it currently going to China. On bauxite, which is used to make aluminium for solar panels, EVs, and batteries, total imports to the market have surged 25 to 26% year on year in January, and 17% of those imports have come from Australia, with a significant proportion coming from Queensland. In health, China has the second largest biopharmaceutical market, which will continue to offer opportunities, particularly for our clinical trial CROs into the future. In education, China is still our largest student source market. And although we have not recovered to where we were pre-COVID in terms of Chinese student enrollments, there's now increased opportunities in terms of direct recruitment and transnational education, with some Chinese students and institutions potentially turning away from the US due to the actions of the US administration. I think all these indices are a reminder that the China story still has a long way to go as a source of opportunity for our Queensland businesses and education providers. A further thing to consider is consumption. And whilst I mentioned before that up until this year, overall consumption had been sluggish in the market, there are still some niche pockets of growth. Certain sectors like online retail, health and wellness products, including complementary medicines, packaged food and beverage, sportswear, urban outdoor apparel, and EVs are experiencing robust growth in the market. And there's also varied performance across different regions and demographics when it comes to consumer sentiment in the market. For example, in McKinsey's latest survey of Chinese consumers, lower tier cities and rural residents show significantly stronger consumer confidence compared to those residents in higher cities. And urban affluent elderly people and low income Gen Z in tier 1 and 2 cities felt more uncertainty, felt a greater deal of uncertainty. And this, I should note, is a shift from the report last year. So important when considering the market to think about some of those nuances when it comes to consumption across regions and demographics. Next is the important role that China plays in terms of investment and partnership in our future green technologies. So David will talk more about this in a moment, so I don't want to labour the point too much on this. But China is obviously the world leader in this area. And if Queensland is to meet its net zero targets through investment in commercially viable renewables, we need to engage positively and proactively with Chinese investors and partners in these areas. And we have the right complementarities with China as the leading global market in this sector to make this a reality. Next, there's the opportunity for Queensland businesses to continue to leverage the free trade agreements that we have with the Chinese market. The CHAFTA, which recently celebrated its 10th anniversary, Hong Kong-Australia Free Trade Agreement, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, all of which offer significant benefits in terms of market access to China and mainland China and Hong Kong. Finally, I just wanted to touch on some of the opportunities that exist as a result of the tariffs and trade restrictions between the US and China. So China and the US account for almost 45% of global output and more than 20% of global trade. So, and as I mentioned earlier, the tensions have put downward pressure on the Chinese market. However, for Queensland, there are some opportunities that arise from that. In beef, for example, China has placed export restrictions on over 300 US abattoirs, which has given Queensland abattoirs the opportunity to occupy some of that market share here in the China market, and we've seen a lot of active demand in that space. In complementary medicines, the US had previously been the #1 import source market for complementary medicines to China. There is an opportunity for Australia as the #2 market to potentially supplant the US in the future. In education, as I mentioned earlier, there's the possibility of some Chinese students turning away from the US market due to the restrictions that the Trump administration has on again, off again, based on Chinese students. And finally, although it was perhaps just a thought bubble of President Trump, there was some talk of potentially imposing tariffs on films produced outside the United States, which would then present opportunities for Queensland with respect to its film and animation capabilities. I should point out for those businesses on the call, if you do export to the US and you are impacted by tariffs, TIQ has set up a tariff response unit, which provides information, support, and resources to help you understand and adapt to these. So please reach out to us if you need any help. So if we just go to the final slide, please. So I just wanted to take the opportunity very briefly to touch on the Queensland-China trade and investment strategy, which was launched by our Minister for Finance, Trade, Employment and Training, the Honourable Ros Bates, in May, prior to her first official visit to the strategy, first official visit to the China market. So I think the strategy has a laser-like focus on leveraging some of those complementarities that I spoke about to generate opportunities for Queensland businesses in the market. And I'll very briefly go through some of the highlights with you here. So in terms of the strategic priorities, first is to build markets in second, third, and fourth tier cities to take advantage of market growth and more positive consumer sentiment in those locations that I mentioned earlier. And we're doing that with a range of activities, including CIIE, which, yes, it's occurring in Shanghai, which is a first tier city. However, we'll be having an extension program to Chengdu and Chongqing, which are new first tier cities and previously second tier cities within the China market. We'll also be supporting small and medium-sized enterprises to leverage expanding e-commerce channels, and we'll be doing that through facilitating opportunities for clients to engage with a leading Chinese e-commerce platform as part of CIIE. We'll talk more about the next one with David in a moment, and that's about seizing growing business opportunities in the thriving Greater Bay Area. And that's leveraging our new office in Shenzhen, which the Minister opened on her visit, together with our offices in Hong Kong and Guangzhou to facilitate trade, investment and market access opportunities in that region. We'll grow export opportunities in clinical trials and healthcare given Chinese capability and Queensland capability in this space through a clinical trials roadshow, and will promote investment aligned with China's market capabilities and goals across traditional energy, commercially viable renewables, EV transport, advanced manufacturing, biotechnology, and infrastructure. And finally, we'll seek to boost international education opportunities, particularly through a shift in our brand here, where we're going to be very focused on presenting Queensland as a destination for employability, given the fact that it has the graduate unemployment rate in the market has been, or youth unemployment market, I should say, in the market has been relatively high. And we'll also have a very strong focus on growing joint program and articulation agreements in both the HE and the vet space, with vocational education capability development a real priority for the central government. That's something we want to push through those various events we have listed there. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we now move on to the main game of today's session, and that is our interview with David Olsen, who is the National President and Chair of the Australia-China Business Council. So David, as I mentioned, is the National President and Chair of the ACBC, which is a business organisation dedicated to fostering and promoting two-way trade, investment and economic cooperation between Australia and China. And David is also currently an international director at King Wood Mallesons and has over 30 years experience in the areas of cross-border investments, corporate finance and financial markets, working with clients, industry bodies and governments in the Asian region. He's a passionate supporter of the New Colombo Plan and is the current chair of the ANU Foundation Board. So David, thank you so much for joining us. Over to the first question, which is just on the market outlook. You've heard a little bit about the state of the market from TIQ's perspective. I'm wondering if you could comment on what you see as the outlook for the China market in the coming 12 months.
Great, thanks, Brett, and thanks for the opportunity to join this webinar. Can I just first of all just congratulate Queensland Government and TRQ on the preparation of the China strategy, trade and investment strategy 2025. You've outlined it very clearly there, but it's well worth a read, and I'd encourage everyone on this call to pick up a copy, download a copy, and have a read of it. What I really like about it, it's clear, it's confident, and it's committed. And right now, they're the three C's that I think are really important as we engage with China. So the economy, well, I think you've summarised that pretty well. At a macro level, China's economy is still is slowing down. There's no doubt about that. All those factors that you've identified are certainly true, but we mustn't forget that it's still operating at between 4.5%, around about 4.5%. That's still a massive figure off a massive base. So you can't underestimate just the scope of the opportunity that growth presents. And I suspect that we will see figures of around about that sort of level for the decade ahead. While we're going to have some big issues and challenges for China and the United States to work through, China is committed to maintaining growth in its economy, and I think we can, one way or the other, it will continue to be there. When we talk about growth from a Queensland perspective, from a broader Australian perspective, I think the important thing is to know that success for exporters and for those engaged with China really depends on how you engage with China, where you do it, and understanding the nuances. You've started to identify that quite clearly in the strategy. You're talking about different regions, different opportunities, different sectors, and that's really important. I think the thing I'd like just to highlight at this point, we haven't touched on it yet, is the fact that China is developing its next 5-year plan right now. That'll be launched in the 2 sessions in March of next year. So that's 2025 to 2026 to 2030. And that will provide us with a very clear understanding of what China's priorities are, what its growth targets are likely to be, and it'll give give good indicators as to where we should be putting our effort. Because ultimately, we're only going to succeed where we're fully aligned with China's development policies. There's no point fighting against it and trying to sell things to China if it's not what they want or it's not in the policy direction. So that I suggest we keep an eye on. It's going to be very important. You've touched also just generally on the complexity of the global economies at the moment. We can't underestimate just how complex the world is right now. It's a minefield for anybody engaged in international trade and investment. Geopolitical tensions, continue to prevail. We see it with our best friends in the United States right now. That the assumptions that we've worked on for the last decade or more around, the certainty of supply chains and who's in those chains is changing overnight. So we need to be alert to all of that. There are significant new rules being applied now around data. And data is going to be the gold of the future in terms of how we trade and invest. And the platforms that we engage on, how we access that data, how we utilize it in a regional sense and in China, particularly where there are strong data limitations, is going to be a key factor for success. And then, of course, you've got the whole overlay of ESG requirements and compliance issues in relation to cross-border trades. The world, and particularly China, is now focused on reducing carbon emissions, decarbonising their economy, and increasingly we're looking at not just Scope 2 but Scope 3 emissions requirements. And so you need to know who your partners are that you're dealing with. So there's a whole lot of complexities around that. So when you talk about what's the outlook for the next 12 months or so, all I can say it's going to be a bumpy ride. But we do have a good understanding of what the big picture issues are now, and your organisation, TRQ, the Australian government broadly, is helping businesses to get a better handle on all this.
Thank you so much, David. I think that very important point of paying attention to China's development priorities under the 5-year plan is very important for our Queensland exporters, and something that we highlight to them. As you say, there's no point in fighting against what the Chinese government wants to do when it comes to its development, and there are benefits in terms of looking at where opportunities can be derived from those. So just moving on to the Greater Bay Area, or GBA, TIQ's recently opened an office in Shenzhen, as you know, to take advantages of opportunities in the region for our clients, working together with those offices that we have in Guangzhou and Hong Kong. And I wonder if you could talk about some of the opportunities for Queensland businesses that exist in the GBA.
Happy to do so. Well, I guess my headline here on this is that the GBA is not just a market, it's a testing ground for the future of China. So I think put that in your mind to start with. It's a big market in its own right, but it's also a testing ground for a lot of what China wants to do and what it wants to be in the decades ahead. Now, I suspect most of the people on this call understand the GBA, the Greater Bay Area, but broadly, it's that area of southern China that's really geographically defined by the Guangdong province and includes Hong Kong as well. So if you can think of the whole of southern China, Yangtze Delta area, you've got 9 major cities, or 9 or 10 major cities in that region, plus Hong Kong. It gives you a population of around about 85 million people. So that is a nice size market. For an Australian exporter, there's plenty to be had in the market of that size, and it's the wealthiest market in China. The GDP within the Greater Bay Area across those cities is higher than any other city in China. So that makes it very attractive for Australians. Its GDP is approximately that of Australia. It's about $2 trillion a year. And it's rolling out a whole lot of new integration policies to integrate the whole region, including Hong Kong. Now, the thing that I think is most exciting at the moment is the concept of Hong Kong being part of southern China. You've got historically very different business systems. Rule of law in Hong Kong is obviously different to what exists in the mainland. The tax systems are quite different across the border. But over the last decade, there's been a strong direction from Beijing to integrate the market. And we're seeing, after a pretty slow start, but we're starting to see in the last year or so, a rapid integration of those two markets. So it's now possible to work, as I have for the last few years, been working in Hong Kong and taking an 18-minute train ride to Shenzhen and working in that office, and then being able to just operate seamlessly across that. Staff employed in one office on the same contract as other tax issues are becoming increasingly similar. So it makes it a much more viable opportunity for Australians and Queenslanders to work there. Now, why should Queensland be interested in this? Well, you've opened up a new office in Shenzhen, and that's fantastic. What that's doing now is you've got Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and Hong Kong. You couldn't ask for a better set of offices. You've got Hong Kong, which provides the certainty of business practice, a rule of law system, largely English spoken as well as Chinese, that gives you a great sense of comfort that it's a financial capital for the world. It's easy to get to. Shenzhen is really where things are scaled up and commercialized. So a lot of companies now from Queensland are looking to have operations in Shenzhen, where they're working in partnership with some of the really exciting tech companies and businesses there, and innovating at a pace that's almost incomprehensible. And then you've got Guangzhou, which is sort of the commercial capital for the region. So that's got the history of trade and commerce and everything that goes with it. So that triangulation of three big cities provides a really interesting opportunity for people that are involved in the things that we have and that China wants. The export of agricultural products of high quality, so agri-tech businesses broadly. Healthcare is a big one. There's a big focus on increasing the health and quality of life of people in that part of the world. And so the products and services that we're providing really tie in nicely to that. They're also extraordinarily interested in education, and there's already relationships between Queensland and Guangdong province more broadly around education, and that's going to continue to increase. So I think we're going to see that sort of scaling in innovation on the mainland, plus the comfort of Hong Kong being a really good combination of opportunity and well worth looking at.
Yeah, thank you, David. And I think, market access schemes like those focused on the health sector may be of interest to some of those on the call. So please, do reach out to TIQ if you have any interests in engaging in the region. So David, if we can now turn to business sentiment. Oxfam China's recently released their 2025 Doing Business in China report. And I know that the ACBC was a supporting organisation of that report. And the report surveyed over 850 foreign and Chinese companies to benchmark business sentiment, commercial priorities, and perceived risks in the China market. And I really think from an Australian perspective, this is the seminal business sentiment report that exists for the China market. So well done to ACBC on supporting that. I wonder if you could comment on some of the key findings from the report that may be of interest to some of those on the call.
Yeah, it really is an interesting report. The last report was done about 2.5 years ago, and it was at a time when relations were still fraught. There were still trade barriers in place. We had only just emerged out of the pandemic trade travel restrictions, so there hadn't been a lot going on. This report is a really interesting one. It completed at the end of last year, so it's quite recent, and it shows that the sentiment is really very, very positive. The headline figures are quite remarkable, and I'll just give them to you. 67% of Australian firms, so these operating engaged with China, rank China as one of their top 3 markets. So that's, China has remained very firm and steady in the market area. 86% believe that the bilateral relationship has improved. Now, I guess that's not surprising because we've gone through a period of stabilization, but to have 86% of nearly 850 respondents speaking in that way is very, very positive indeed. And over half reported that doing business in China is now easier than it was before. So before being 2 years ago. So these are quite positive indicators, and actually are quite different from the survey reports that we're seeing coming out of the OzCham, sorry, not OzCham, the US Chamber of Commerce and the Europeans, who report still continuing challenges for entering the market. But from an Australian perspective, because of largely of the complementarity of our economies and because of the deep engagement that we've had over decades and decades, I think that there's a comfort level that is really, really positive. A couple of the big things, where's the growth coming from? The growth is coming in agribusiness, clean energy tech, biopharma and education. And they're all sectors where Queenslanders have got really strong advantages. There's investment into Australia is probably the only negative sentiment in all of this. And there was a not surprisingly negative view from those Chinese companies that were looking at investment into Australia, where 93% of them surveyed said that the FIRB guidelines were unclear. Now that we can imagine, there's sentiment is a big thing in China, and people will tag along and just tick the negative box quite easily in that. But it is an issue we've got to address, and we know that our government is looking at this, actively. But the other important thing that came out of this is that many Australian companies, and I include a number of Queensland companies, are really adapting to new markets. They are starting to diversify supply chains. And that doesn't mean moving out of China. It means engaging with China in a different way. So a number of those companies in the examples, the case studies that were presented at the launch, were companies that are working in China with Chinese partners, but they're also working outside of China, in the ASEAN region, in the Philippines, in Malaysia, and Singapore, together. Having built on relationships they've had for decades, they're now taking that into different markets and working together. So it's a very interesting development in terms of how we're starting to engage with China. We're looking far more strategically, and we're leveraging a lot of the relationships that have remained in place for long periods of time. So I think the takeaway for me is that business leaders are now pretty smart. They're savvy. They're starting to spend more time on understanding the China market, and those that put in the time, energy to doing that are the ones that will reap the rewards in the years ahead.
Yeah, thank you, David. I think that increased positivity re the market and an indication from many respondents about potentially expanding the business in the market is really pleasing to see, particularly from whence we came 2.5 years ago. So a really marked change. And I think for all of those on the call, we'll make sure we circulate a copy of that report to you all subsequent to today. So the next question is something I alluded to earlier, but wanted to give you the opportunity to talk on, given your vast experience, and that's opportunities for investment and partnership in the green economy. So ACBC as an organisation has had a particular focus on promoting opportunities for collaboration and investment between Australia and China in this area. So what opportunities do you see in this space for Queensland and China?
Okay, let's just set the scene on this first of all. China has set some very ambitious decarbonisation targets. It's got a net zero of 2060. Now that's a bit further than our original 2050 target, but they're well on the track to decarbonising their economy. They are the leaders in virtually every sector that's involved in decarbonisation, whether it's the production of photovoltaic cells, wind turbines, battery production, EV transport mechanisms, right across the entire supply chain in virtually every sector in China. And it's fully integrated into China's 5-year plan, the current one. And we can rest assured that it will be prominent in the next 5-year plan. So what that means is that when you're looking at China, Chinese businesses have this mindset that, it is absolutely imperative that we decarbonise our economy, our sector, and our business. And so they're wanting to work with companies that can help them in that endeavour, or help other companies in their own endeavours to decarbonise. So already we see China, as a major exporter to the rest of the world, pretty well every country in the world, barring the United States now because of tariffs and parts of Europe because of tariffs. But, the export of the technology for renewable energy, clean energy, is going at most extraordinary rates. And I think that's where the opportunity arises, for collaboration. Chinese firms are actively seeking collaborations. They have amazing R&D capacity, they have amazing technology, and they have the capital, but they don't have everything. And we have some of the best and brightest scientists. We have amazing companies, producing niche products that may not have been considered in China, or which can become part of a broader supply chain or value chain in that space. So, in Queensland's case, you've got abundant sources of renewable energy, solar, wind, hydrogen potentially, as big exports. You've got, as you've mentioned, LNG, which is a gas to support on a transition basis, the transition to net zero. And we've got expertise in a whole range of ESG services, carbon management, and project delivery. So all of those things combined are value add to China, and they're seen as value adds. So the challenge now, I think, for all of us is to think about, where's the intersection of China's needs and what they've got and what we want to do and our capabilities. And that's been the driver for ACBC's focus on decarbonisation. We have a Green Economy Forum, which has been running now for the last nearly 3 years, because we identify the opportunity to collaborate in this area as probably the sweet spot in terms of relationship. It's the one that it solves a problem for the world, not just us, but it can help us in our own upscaling and in our value capabilities and what we do internally. So a couple of ideas we've thrown out, and we discussed this in Hong Kong a little while ago. Things like, perhaps it's now timely for Queensland to think about setting up some sort of special economic zone linked to one of your fine deep water ports that could become an area for decarbonisation industries, whether it's in specific areas or manufacturing capabilities using renewable energy from in the country, and then exporting into the region under the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Free Trade Agreement. So that's the big agreement, the largest free trade agreement in the world. Australia, China, all the ASEAN nations, South Korea, Japan, and New Zealand are all members of that. So it's a fantastic trade agreement, and it's the lens through which China looks at operating throughout the whole of Southeast Asia. So the mindset here is think about opportunities to work together, collaborate. Think about Queensland as providing a base for that, where we can create manufacturing capability using Chinese knowledge and capability, perhaps some capital, combining it also with markets in Southeast Asia and or partners from Southeast Asia. So there's no reason why you couldn't have a Japanese or South Korean partner sitting in a zone, alongside a Chinese partner as well, where it's all being supported by the Queensland government. So that's just one idea to think a little bit differently about how we do things. But I think from my point of view, the key now is just to think about what we need, how we might be able to do it, and then start putting those ideas on the table. Because now, particularly with the Prime Minister going to Beijing next week, and where we do know that decarbonisation will be a topic of discussion, I think this is an ideal opportunity to progress that.
David, I really like your idea of special economic zones, drawing from the Chinese there potentially for the Australian market. And I think, this is obviously an area where we want to see investment growth in the Queensland economy. And TIQ continues to engage with a wide range of investors in this area. And in fact, whilst the Minister was here in China, she hosted an investment roundtable which comprised several renewables investors here in the market. So I just wanted to turn now to some of the challenges with doing business in the market. I'm conscious that a few of the businesses that are joining us today will be new to the China market and might not have had significant involvement in the market in the past. So what do you think are some of the challenges of doing business here in China and ways to address these? And what should businesses be considering in their business strategies?
Well, I think the first point is you've got to build up some knowledge of China. We've had several years now where China has not been as prominent in our strategic thinking as it should have been, but it's now time to reactivate a China policy. And I think any company that's looking to internationalize needs to understand China. Don't have to be doing business with China all the time, but you need to understand how China is influencing other markets with which we might want to engage. So the first point, I think, is develop your China capability. And I think that important part of that is jump on a plane if you haven't been up there recently. Go and visit. It's visa free now for 30 days. You can walk in with your Australian passport straight in, and you can visit pretty well any part of China that you want to. So get up there, have a look at what's going on. Drop in at one of the TRQ offices. Give you a plug for that because you've got some fantastic people up there on the ground, and they'll be able to direct companies to people that they should go and have a look at. Not necessarily to partner up with, but just to get a sense of what's happening, the scale and pace of change that's going on. So that's the first one, capabilities. Second thing, I think, is to realise, as we've always said, that China is such a big place that you need to be very clear about where you go within China. The markets, tier one markets, are highly competitive, can be very profitable, but they can be very challenging, particularly for first-time entrants. So think about the second and third tier cities. Those cities are still 5 to 15 million people big. They're big, and think about that. Think about the Greater Bay Area. I think that's really important. Hong Kong's a great stop-off point. It's very comfortable. It's a great place to visit. But then just jump on the train, have a high-speed train experience. 18 minutes across to Shenzhen, 40 minutes to Guangzhou. Or further if you want to go all the way to Beijing, Shanghai. Just do that and get across there. You need to localize your products. Chinese consumers are becoming very knowledgeable about world products. They're also very proud of their own products. They've improved significantly in recent times. And so just because you've got a great product in Australia doesn't necessarily mean that it will resonate in the China market. So I think they're the important points. And I think the final point would be just to realise that there's plenty of good people out there to help you in this journey. China is daunting. You've got TRQ, you've got the Australian Austrade itself. You've got organisations like the Australian Chamber of Commerce on the ground in most of the major cities. And of course, here in Australia, you've got the Australia-China Business Council, which is like the sister organisation of AusChams. That are providing regular seminars and updates on various things.
Yeah, thank you, David. I think that localization point and getting advice on that is really, really important. You've seen increased demand in the Chinese market for local products as quality has really lifted. And I think a commitment to buying local with the current geopolitical uncertainties. So that's going to be more salient than ever, I think, now. So just a quick one to finish before we go to questions. So in one sentence, how would you sum up future opportunities for Queensland businesses in the China market going forward?
Oh, tricky one. Look, the question isn't whether there are opportunities. You'll identify those opportunities very carefully. I think the question is, are we ready for it? And are we willing to engage? I think they're the two questions, and you need to start to be able to answer that question yourself in every business. Are we ready to engage, and will we do it with discipline and purpose?
That's perfect. I think finishing on that question. Well, David, thank you so much for your time. We'll now move on to our Q&A session. So, Scott, if I can hand it over to you to handle the questions.
Yeah, thanks, Rhett. And geez, you certainly left the a tough question to the end there for David, put him on the spot. But great answer and great conversation and session there. Look, we do have a few minutes remaining. If people do have questions, please drop them in the chat. Of course, we will send links out afterwards for how you can continue to engage with TIQ. However, look, a couple of questions to kick things off. We did touch on investment very briefly, David, and some of the sort of, I guess, challenges and complexities there. We do have a broader question, though, from Simon within our strategy and performance team. Chinese investment in the Queensland mining industry has served us well for a couple of decades. But how can we grow and diversify China's investment towards other priority sectors in Queensland, for instance, tourism, agribusiness, or renewables?
Well, I think the starting point is the fact you've now got a 2025 China strategy, from the state. It signifies intent and commitment. And I think getting that message out to Chinese counterparts, Chinese companies, that the Queensland government is right behind this, sends a very strong signal to companies in China that there are multiple opportunities available, within Queensland. The next point around that, I suppose, at the corporate enterprise level, is for companies, just as I said before, to jump on a plane and, in whatever sector they're in, and go to various of the expos. So this year we've got the Chinese International Import Expo, CIIE, in October, at the end of October in Shanghai. It's a massive thing, but join on. I think TIQ will have a good representation up there. But that's a magnificent opportunity for smaller companies, particularly SMEs, to enjoy the support of your state, but be in good company with lots of other Australians up there who are doing similar things, trying to expand that market, and sending the message that we're open for business, we're looking for partnerships, we're looking to do things differently.
Thanks, David. And I'll just touch on, you mentioned there and earlier as well about the hop on a plane, come and see what's sort of, over there. To me, that stands out, that sort of increased kind of openness in that perspective stands out as a bit of a counterweight to some of the other sort of, unilateral actions of some other countries who shall remain nameless. My question there becomes, how do you see China increasingly, I guess, positioning, we hear China talk about, aiming to be, to quote the two sessions recently, an anchor of stability and some of this sort of terminology and language. Could we expand a little bit more on, I guess, where the Chinese central government is, I guess, seizing an opportunity to position as an alternative to, the United States, for example, and where that may open up opportunities for Queensland?
Wow, that's a big question. I think we all have a good sense of the fact that China is seeking to expand its influence around the region. It's doing so for its own reasons. It wants to continue to develop its economy, and to do that, it wants an environment in which it feels comfortable to operate. And it would prefer that other countries around the region sort of sign up to a platform of engagements and relationships that is one that it's more comfortable with, rather than the traditional Western model of engagement that we've seen in the past. So through that, we're seeing a lot more sort of soft diplomacy, a lot more engagement around the region. The Belt and Road Initiative, of course, is one. There's financial engagement and to encourage things, but it's gone beyond just the infrastructure to social engagement, to technology as well. So it's doing that, and of course there's a bit of hard diplomacy around, which we've been on the other end of from time to time. But I think we just have to recognise that China is a global power, and it's in our region, and it's going to exercise the sort of power that you expect a major global power to exercise. So the challenge for not just Australia, but for the whole of our region, is first of all to understand and appreciate what's going on, and I think we're starting to have a better understanding of that. We have a better understanding of the mechanisms that China's using, and then we just need to think about what our interests are and how we work in an environment like that to our advantage. Because ultimately, trade and investment has to benefit Australia. We're doing this because it's in our interest to do so. So we have to work out, well, what are the channels? Where can we best engage with China? what's China doing really well that we might be able to piggyback off and leverage without compromising our other important values that we hold dear to ourselves.
Thanks, David. Look, I may ask, we are wrapping up shortly, but could I have an extra 3 or 4 minutes to cover off the last couple of questions if both speakers can stay on, if that's okay? Look, thank you for that. We do have a question from one of the attendees. I'm looking to take a patented product into the Chinese market and wanted to ask, what practical steps or protections do you recommend to safeguard IP when engaging with potential manufacturers or distributors in China? Are there particular risks or legal gaps we should be aware of?
Okay, well, I'm a lawyer, and we've got a whole host of offices around China, and IP is a big thing which we do. Yep. So, starting point, get advice. It doesn't matter who you seek, but get advice. What's important to understand is China is just innovating so fast. It's now the largest, recipient of trademarks and patents of any country in the world. So it's in their interest to ensure that the IP registration process and protection process does protect those businesses, because they're innovating faster than we are. So there is a system in place. My advice would be, look up the name of a good law firm. Kingwood Mallison is a terrific one, but there are many other firms around. Seek advice, because there is a pathway through all this, and it's not like it used to be in the past. There's much more confidence in being able to protect your IP and enforce it if need be.
Thanks, David.
Scott,
and
if I
thanks.
can just,
yes,
if
please.
I can just quickly add to that, just echoing David's point in terms of it's critical to get advice. TIQ provides referrals to a panel of different legal services providers that can help you here in the market. So please reach out to us subsequent to this call, and we can share that panel with you.
Thanks, Rhett and David. And look, just while I close out the last couple of questions, I will just bring up a QR code on the screen so people can book a consultation with TIQ, or of course we will send out further information after this. But just while that comes up on your screen, 2 quick final questions. I've just shared the wrong presentation. Please ignore that one. Final question, or second last question rather. Apart from government clean energy investment, what is the status of corporate Scope 3 initiatives? And I'll just bring that link up as you answer that question, David and Rhett.
What is the status of Scope 3? Well, I think we're moving down a path where Scope 3 is becoming more relevant to all companies. The ability to be able to compete in the world is going to be dependent on our ability to provide a product or a service that we can demonstrate, is going to meet the highest ESG standards around the world. That's also being driven by initiatives around about carbon trading across borders, and so the mechanism for trading across borders with carbon credits. There's a lot of work being done in Australia, around the region, and in China on that right now. I think this is still a work in progress. It's a top priority for federal government and state governments to be looking at this, because we need to understand it, and we need to make sure we retain a seat at the table to ensure that that where we end up with the standards is in our best interest for our Australian companies.
Thanks, David. And look, as we wrap things up, I might just reframe the last question to give you both the opportunity to make a couple of closing remarks. So there was a question around policy or regulatory changes that exporters should be aware of, but I might, as China responds to current US trade barriers, but I might open that question up slightly more broadly for your closing remarks, and I guess ask on some sort of final takeaway points about the Queensland-China outlook as you both see it as a way of conclusion. We'll start with you, David, and then on to you, Rhett, and then we'll close out the session.
Look, I think Queensland's got some outstanding advantages. Whether it's energy, technology, agriculture, health, education, you've got everything that China wants, and you do it in spades, and you do it exceptionally well. So I think and it ties in with the growth that you've seen over the last couple of years. So I think Queensland is an exceptionally good position to drive forward engagement with China. And I'll just add to that the comment I made before, that your position, particularly, right on the cusp of the regional economic, comprehensive economic partnership zone, sort of Southeast Asia, puts Queensland in a very enviable position for accessing the regional markets using partnerships with China in particular.
Over to you, Rhett.
Yeah, thank you, David. That's a terrific summary, I think, to finish. I think from my perspective, I just want to re-emphasize what I said in my presentation, and that is our market complementarities remain incredibly strong and robust. So no matter what you hear in terms of the white noise when it comes to the media, this market, there is still a long way to go when it comes to the Queensland-China trade and investment story. As David mentioned, we have got the connections across resources, energy, food and agriculture, health, education, and tourism, and we can continue to benefit one another and grow going forward into the future.
Thanks, Rhett, and thanks, David. Look, I won't add anything further than that, given we are now over time, and I think you've both summarised it up very well. Thank you both for your time today, and thank you to all who have dialed in. We will send a follow-up email with further resources and how you can continue the conversation. Thank you, and good afternoon.
Bye.